In this podcast episode, Dr. Robert Lustig delves deeply into how modern food systems and environmental factors have hijacked human biology, impacting mental health, systemic health, and even society at large. He explains the physiological mechanisms that underlie chronic stress and addiction, the role of ultra-processed foods, especially sugar, and the corporate interests that perpetuate these problems. Dr. Lustig also discusses the neurological and biochemical underpinnings affecting behavior, cognition, and emotional resilience, as well as practical ways to counteract these adverse effects. Dr. Lustig introduces the concept of the hostage brain, which he describes as the addicted brain caught in a cycle of chronic toxic stress. He explains that the human brain, particularly the amygdala, is wired to handle acute pain and uncertainty through adaptive learning. Originally, when faced with pain or threat, the brain would quickly develop neural circuits to prevent recurrence. However, contemporary society suffers from persistent uncertainty and pain, producing a continual state he terms pain brain. To avoid this ongoing distress, individuals turn to dopamine-driven behaviors, such as use of drugs, cocaine, alcohol, nicotine, sugar consumption, gambling, social media, and other addictive activities, to alleviate emotional and physical pain. Dopamine, he explains, is an excitatory neurotransmitter tied to pleasure, but chronic overstimulation leads to neuronal downregulation, tolerance, cell death, and ultimately addiction. The amygdala, often mischaracterized solely as the fear center, functions far more broadly. It distinguishes mundane from novel stimuli and assesses threat versus reward, thereby guiding survival responses. The amygdala's activity is normally regulated by four key control systems: the prefrontal cortex, reasoning; the hippocampus, memory; the afferent vagus nerve, interoception and intuition via gut-brain signaling; and oxytocin, mediating feelings of safety. Each of these systems is currently under assault by environmental changes, such as excess dopamine and cortisol, resulting in an overactive amygdala that behaves like buckshot, indiscriminately firing and contributing to systemic and mental health crises. For example, damage to the prefrontal cortex diminishes impulse control, while hippocampal dysfunction impairs the ability to remember previous threats and adapt. The vagus nerve signaling is disrupted by unhealthy gut microbiota, partly owing to poor diets, and oxytocin signaling is compromised by early childhood trauma, leading to methylation of oxytocin receptors and a reduced capacity to perceive safety. Dr. Lustig points to ultra-processed foods as a principal factor driving the health crisis. He defines real food as unaltered foods from nature, plants or animals, whereas ultra-processed foods have undergone significant human manipulation prior to consumption. 5 elements characterize problematic ultra-processed foods: excessive sugar, insufficient fiber, inadequate omega-3 fatty acids, overuse of emulsifiers, and petroleum-based food dyes. Sugar, particularly fructose, is a major culprit because it metabolizes similarly to alcohol, impairing mitochondrial function and depleting cellular ATP, the energy currency critical for brain and liver health. This ATP depletion manifests as brain fog, irritability, anxiety, depression, and cognitive decline. Sugar is addictive and pervasive in nearly all processed foods, contributing to alarming increases in newborn obesity and chronic diseases such as diabetes. The podcast highlights the intertwined roles of the food, pharmaceutical, and tobacco industries, which knowingly perpetuate public harm to maintain profits. Though no explicit smoking gun document proving collusion exists, extensive evidence from industry archives reveals that these corporations understand and exploit their products' addictive qualities. The expansion of sugar and ultra-processed products as legal yet addictive commodities generates enormous profit margins beyond population growth. Attempts to regulate foods like soda through policy face political resistance rooted in constituents' emotional reliance on these products as mollifiers of pain. Additionally, heavy corporate influence on political funding and messaging sustains the status quo, obstructing meaningful reform. Dr. Lustig critiques the concept of personal responsibility, tracing its origins to the tobacco industry's strategy to deflect blame amidst growing scientific evidence of harm. The notion framed smoking-related disease as a matter of individual choice, effectively shifting attention away from industry accountability. He equates personal responsibility to a societal form of alexithymia, emotional numbness or blindness that denies internal experience and empathy for others. This ideological construct fosters victim blaming and obscures systemic drivers of health problems, falsely promoting freedom of choice while masking structural issues. The episode explores the epidemic of loneliness and anxiety, linking it neurologically to serotonin deficiency. Serotonin allows individuals to feel content even in solitude, whereas loneliness corresponds with a serotonin-depleted state marked by separation anxiety. Modern stressors such as screen exposure, cortisol elevation, and dopamine excess deplete serotonin, undermining social connection, intuition, and gut-brain signals via the vagus nerve. Loneliness is characterized as being in bad company with oneself, while solitude is the peaceful, chosen state of being alone. The prevalence of digital rather than face-to-face interactions contributes to feelings of being alone together, exacerbating serotonin suppression. Dr. Lustig discusses the afferent vagus nerve as the communication highway from the gut microbiome to the brain, emphasizing that 90% of the body's serotonin is produced in the gut. Dietary tryptophan, an essential amino acid and serotonin precursor found in foods like eggs and fish, plays a central role in this signaling. A fascinating recent hypothesis proposed is that tryptophan molecules themselves fluoresce, emitting light photons that may transmit information through the vagus nerve to the brain, suggesting a novel mechanism beyond classical neurotransmission. This underscores the crucial role of whole food nutrition in maintaining gut health, brain function, and emotional well-being. The podcast contrasts whole fruit with fruit juice, pointing out that juice lacks the insoluble fiber necessary for moderating glucose absorption and supporting gut integrity. Fiber works as a synergistic duo. Insoluble fiber forms a lattice that slows nutrient absorption, while soluble fiber plugs the lattice's holes, reducing glycemic spikes and feeding beneficial gut bacteria. Fiber also promotes intestinal transit, satiety signaling, and production of anti-inflammatory short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. Loss of fiber and other nutrients during food processing has contributed to gut dysbiosis and systemic inflammation. Dr. Lustig's company, BioLumen, has developed a fiber replacement therapy called Munch Munch that expands in the gut to mimic natural fiber's protective effects, showing promising clinical improvements in insulin response and lipid profiles. Dr. Lustig distinguishes three types of fat: subcutaneous, beneath the skin; visceral, around organs; and liver fat. Subcutaneous fat acts as a metabolic sink, often protective, while visceral and liver fat are closely linked to metabolic disease severity. Critically, one can have thin outside, fat inside, reflecting significant visceral or liver fat without external obesity. For example, patients with severe depression may lose subcutaneous fat but accumulate visceral fat due to chronic stress and cortisol elevation. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease has surged with sugar consumption, now affecting 45% of Americans. Liver fat can be reduced primarily by eliminating excess sugar and alcohol, and through dietary time restriction strategies. The discussion highlights how cell phones and social media serve as potent sources of cortisol and dopamine stimulation, sustaining the hostage brain. Variable reward schedules embedded in apps and platforms hijack attention, create compulsive behaviors, and contribute significantly to stress and inflammation. Studies have shown happy apps generate minimal user engagement, in contrast to unhappy apps that command hours of use daily, correlating with decreased mental well-being. Practical recommendations include restricting phone use, avoiding multitasking, which induces cortisol surges, and fostering mindfulness. France and Australia's measures to ban cell phones from schools are highlighted as promising steps. Beyond nutritional factors, environmental pollutants such as ionizing radiation, air pollution, microplastics, and chemical contaminants, BPA, PFAS, phthalates, pesticides, glyphosate, also assault mitochondrial function. While ubiquitous and difficult to eliminate, behaviors like avoiding microwaving plastics and reducing exposure to single-use plastics can mitigate harm. The pervasive nature of these toxicants adds to the energetic and physiological burden on cells and organs, further compromising health. To counteract the chronic stress and neurochemical imbalances, Dr. Lustig prescribes 4 foundational actions, all of which are free and supported by scientific evidence. First, connect face-to-face with others to restore serotonin through genuine social interaction. Second, contribute to others, as purposeful altruism boosts serotonin levels. Third, cope effectively using mindfulness, one task at a time, regular exercise to increase BDNF, promoting neuroplasticity, and proper sleep to facilitate autophagy and brain detoxification. Fourth, cook and consume real food, which provides essential nutrients, fosters social bonding, and aligns biology with environment. These steps restore balance by lowering cortisol and dopamine overactivation while increasing serotonin. Dr. Lustig emphasizes that understanding the root causes of health crises, from biochemical to societal levels, is essential to reclaiming health and agency. While external forces and industry machinations make change difficult, personal and collective empowerment begins with knowledge. Tools like the perfect rubric he helped develop assist consumers in navigating food choices that protect the liver, feed the gut, and support the brain, regardless of whether foods are ultra-processed. Awareness is a foundational step toward meaningful behavioral change. Neurons are disproportionately energy-demanding cells, requiring ATP for neurotransmission, protein folding, and especially neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to adapt and learn. Despite abundant mitochondria, neurons are energy vulnerable, and ATP production is frequently compromised due to environmental toxins, inflammation, and excess cortisol. Cortisol also increases firing rates, thereby raising energy demands. Insufficient ATP impedes essential brain functions, manifesting as cognitive decline, mood disorders, and in extreme cases, neurodegeneration such as Alzheimer's disease. This ties directly to the metabolic dysfunction seen in populations consuming ultra-processed diets and living under chronic stress. For practical guidance, Dr. Lustig advises that any packaged food with a label is essentially a warning. It indicates human manipulation, alterations, or additives that could compromise health. Real, whole foods, such as fresh fruits and vegetables, typically lack labels because they require no processing or marketing. Using tools like the Perfect Toe website, consumers can evaluate whether foods protect their liver, nourish their gut, and support brain function, enabling informed decisions that counteract harmful food industry practices.